Hello, everybody. We're really excited that you're here joining us today for today's webinar on the cycle of violence in domestic violence nonprofits. And whenever we start off our presentations, we like to start off by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we're on today, even though we're meeting in a virtual space. So Healing Equity United is on the lands of the Muwekma, the Ohlone, the Piscataway, and unceded Duwamish territories. It's important that we're taking this moment to recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since even before the US was formed as a nation. And while the numbers vary, in 1492, there were approximately 100 million Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas already living here. And today, unfortunately, there are only 6.8 million Indigenous peoples left in the US and 574 federally recognized tribes. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence that have been inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and their culture, which continues to the present day. So please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past and the present, and to consider how we are and can each, in our own way, try to move forward to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities. Thank you. And now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Fiona.
Thank you, Jess. We'd also like to offer an authentic and heartfelt welcome from Healing Equity United to you. And we'd like to welcome specifically into this space people of all genders. This might include people who identify as women, men, trans, genderqueer, or others. People of African descent, Black, African American, Asian descent, Arab descent, Pacific Islander, European descent, those who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, Latina, people indigenous to this land, and people of mixed and multiple descents. We also welcome all of the languages that might be spoken here, including Spanish, English, indigenous languages, sign language, etc. People of different working and different class backgrounds. So it's working class, middle class, owning class, or those of us who aren't sure where we might fit on the class spectrum. We also want to welcome people currently struggling to get access to resources necessary for survival, like healthcare, adequate housing, reliable transportation, and childcare. And people who are currently have more access to those resources. Want to welcome people with disabilities, visible or invisible, people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, pansexual, queer, or others for whom none of those labels might fit. We want to welcome your bodies in the different ways you experience yours. It might include chronic pain, strength, tension, etc. We welcome survivors. We welcome people who identify as activists and people who do not. The single, married, partnered, dating, those in monogamous relationships, or those in polyamorous relationships. We welcome those who are sexually active and those who are not. Those in their teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. We welcome your emotions, joy and bliss, grief, rage, indignation, contentment, disappointment. We welcome those who support your ability to join us here virtually. That might include your families, genetic or otherwise. We welcome people of different faiths, religious traditions, faith practices, private practices that don't belong to tradition, agnostics, atheists, and seekers. Last but not least, we welcome people who have been in workshops like these before and people who have not. So from Healing Equity United to you, welcome, welcome, welcome. We'd also like to acknowledge that, as you know, working in the sector, being interested in the topic of domestic violence, that this is October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Recently, I'm hearing it also be called Domestic Violence Action Month or Domestic Violence Awareness to Action Month. Whatever you and your organization or those in your jurisdiction call it, we wanted to just lift that up. We know that it's been a long month and it's only half over. There's still ways to go. You're putting in extra time and taking on a heavier emotional labor during this time of year. And so we just wanted to hold space and acknowledge that.
Thank you, Fiona. And so at Healing Equity United, we like to give some of our identity markers that we come into the space with that informs the work that we do, instead of kind of reading off of a list from our resumes. And so I will start us off. Hello, everyone. My name is Cassie Whitebread. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as a mixed race person. I also identify as Chinese American. I have a white father, and my mother was born in Hong Kong. I am native to New Jersey, though I call the city of Philadelphia home. That's where I went to grad school. I have my master's in education, and I used to be a middle school science teacher. So I identify as an educator through and through. Currently, I live in Seattle, Washington with my partner and our dog, who is pictured there. And I also wear the hat as an education director for a small nonprofit out here in Seattle.
Thank you, Cassie. My name is Fiona Oliphant, and I'm a first generation Jamaican American. Folks in my family range from being completely undocumented to being naturalized citizens. And so growing up, I was really faced with the oppression that immigrants, particularly those without documentation, face on a daily basis and the kinds of issues they have to navigate. Having said that, I'm a US citizen, and that's an identity that holds a lot of power and privilege in this society. And I always had to ask myself how to leverage that to be in solidarity with immigrants. Beneath the American flag, you'll see that Scales of Justice, I am an attorney barred in Washington, D.C. and New York. And even though I don't currently practice, my ability to put ESQ behind my last name grants my voice a certain amount of credibility and value in some spaces that I wouldn't alternatively have. I'm from the South Bronx in New York City, a community which is primarily Black and Brown, higher rates of poverty, crime, drug use, and higher rates of love and support. And last but not least, for these purposes, I am married to a cisgender white male who is an immigrant from Europe. Often talk about the fact that he's never questioned about his right to belong, like my other immigrant family members. Um, his white male privilege, the impact of societal racism on our family and in our community and society in general. We have three biracial children, half Black, half white. My eldest identifies as a Black woman with a white father because that um, reflects her lived experience. Jess?
So hi, everybody. My name is Jess Aiden Lee, and I identify as a first generation immigrant. Came to the US when I was 4 years old with my parents because they were afraid of what happened to Hong Kong, which was a British colony at the time, when Hong Kong was handed back over to China. They were afraid that we would lose our rights. And unfortunately, that is something that's happening today to some of my relatives who still live there. So as an Asian American girl growing up in New York City, I was a latchkey kid. My parents worked blue collar jobs. My mom was a seamstress in the garment district of Manhattan. My dad worked overnights cleaning commercial kitchens of restaurants. Being the eldest in my family, I was the first to go to school and take ESL classes and to learn English. And as soon as I had learned enough English, I became the de facto interpreter and translator for both of my parents. And that's still something that I do today. Currently, I live in Oakland, California with my partner who's pictured here. He is a community activist, community organizer, and he is actually holding Hanson, who is my service dog because I live with an invisible disability. At the bottom, you'll also see a picture of another dog who is named Kobe, and he is our pandemic puppy. And so that's a little bit about me and my family. We also wanted to tell you a little bit about Healing Equity United and what we do. And so Fiona and I have been in the domestic violence field for what, combined 40 years or so. And as we were advancing in the field, we began to see more and more often that people who were leaders did not necessarily reflect those whom we were serving. And as individuals who identified as global majority or Black, Indigenous people of color, we went through our own challenges in working in the nonprofit sector and specifically in domestic violence and sexual assault nonprofit organizations. And so about 5 years ago, we came together and founded Healing Equity United. Really, what we do is provide consulting for organizations to help them build a culture of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And some of the work that we do include workshops, series of trainings, and different types of audits, as well as executive coaching.
And so our goals for today, for our time together, I'll read them aloud for accessibility purposes. Give names to the types of violence that are inconspicuously and conspicuously perpetuated within our organizations against survivors who identify as Black, Indigenous people of color and other marginalized identities, continuing the cycle of abuse within our workplaces. Recognize how power and control often show up within nonprofit cultures and traditional hierarchy structures. Identify positive coping and healing practices that your organization can engage in to support staff with marginalized identities. And finally, discuss and strategize actions and next steps that your organization can take toward healing and building solidarity.
And so even though this is in webinar format, we wanted to share some group agreements that we hope will make this experience more beneficial to you. So in order to access this information, hopefully you won't engage in mentally the oppression Olympics. So from our perspective and the way we approach this work, all of our oppression is tied and therefore all of our liberation is tied. And so as we move through the content, just to keep that in mind, we hope you agree with us in approaching it from that space. A brave space, not necessarily a safe space. There might be some things that come up that might activate you in some way. Please let's address it, notice it, and then collectively move forward. Engage listening. Sometimes when we have these conversations, we listen with the note of arguing, winning, being right? So we're asking folks to just practice engaged listening. In the chat, if you find, or in the Q&A, if you find that you're taking up a disproportionate amount of space, please be mindful of that and create space for others to participate equitably. In the chat or in the Q&A, please address the group, not a specific individual response or question that you see there. Say it messy in that chat, those questions posed. We don't have a lot of time, so we can't linger on perfection. We're not going to settle it all in 1 hour, so be okay with non-closure. We really prioritize confidentiality and continue to take care of yourself.
In our technical agreements, while we are on a webinar format, I think everyone will be muted unless we ask you to unmute yourselves. I saw that someone used the raise hand function. If there is a question that comes up, feel free to try to use that raise hand function, though. We'd love to see those questions coming through the Q&A. That way we can keep track of those questions and try to get to as many as possible. Also, feel free to communicate with us as panelists through the chat. And if you have the ability to use the reactions buttons to express what you're thinking and feeling, feel free to do that as well.
And so we'd like to just remind everyone to take care of yourselves as we're going through this content, to ensure that some of the content that we're going to be talking about, right, is geared towards not only folks with marginalized identities and how our organizations might be unintentionally perpetrating harm or um, replicating white supremacist norms. So that's one form of harm. Another form of harm is that we might have, we not might have, we definitely have a multitude of identities, some of which might be associated with marginalization in terms of race, ethnicity, um, gender identity, sexual orientation, and simultaneously be survivors, right? So there are a variety of different spaces and ways in which we might be activated during some of this conversation, this upcoming conversation. Breathe. Take care of yourself. Whatever it is that you have to do. And then, we're going to be talking about some specific healing practices later, but just to be mindful of taking care of yourself at this point. So, given our target audience for today's conversation, I am sure that most of you are familiar with this cycle, that you can, reiterate it in your sleep. You can talk about it in community. You can talk to those who aren't in the DVSA space, and you can discuss it knowledgeably. But we wanted to very briefly go over what this is so that we can put it in correlation to the cycle that Jess is going to be talking about shortly. All right, so the typical cycle of abuse, and this isn't the same for everyone, as we all know, but the typical cycle of abuse starts with the honeymoon phase, right? Otherwise, why would we get into these relationships? Why would we be attracted to each other? There's this period of, everything's going to be fine. We're going to treat you well, right? And slowly but surely, sometimes not that slowly, and sometimes that period gets shorter and shorter. But there's this tension building phase of calling folks out of their names, of, gaslighting folks, of physical aggression. And then it leads up to this explosion phase. Sometimes that results in physical violence, but certainly in verbal violence, psychological violence, some kind of explosive event that happens, which usually leads right into the honeymoon phase again, in which the perpetrator of violence says, I didn't mean it. I apologize. It will never happen again. Or, you misunderstood me. That's not what I meant. Right? And then the cycle of abuse happens again and again and again. So we just wanted to remind everybody, we know you all know this, remind everyone so that Jess can take it to the next level in correlation to what we're talking about next.
And so as individuals who identify as BIPOC or global majority, one of the things that Fiona and I saw is that this cycle of abuse actually also shows up in nonprofit organizations, specifically for people with marginalized identities. And so let's take a breath before I go through this, because whenever we've shared this with folks, it can be really difficult, right? So the way that this looks in nonprofit organization is that the honeymoon phase is really your first, week or two or month of work, right? You're really excited at your job. You're so glad that you got hired. You go in, you're meeting everyone, really just, you can't wait to get started, right? And then, if you're in particularly a white-led organization, you might start making some suggestions like, we should probably have a community group for our Black domestic violence survivors, because it's important for them, and they're also experiencing racial trauma right now. And your ED or your manager might say, well, there's no funding for that. There's no need for that, right? So we continue to make suggestions that are really rooted in thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we get pushback. That becomes a tension building. So then we're kind of like butting heads, right? An explosion phase might look like, to the extreme, it could be retaliation, it could be not promoting certain folks, it could be sending an open letter, going to the board, going above your manager. And then, what we might hear is like, well, we're working on it, right? We'll deal with it. We understand it's really important. Let's look into this, right? And so then we go back into a honeymoon phase where we think, okay, maybe things will get better. Maybe, what I did and what I said might actually get them to be thinking a little bit more about how to provide culturally specific and culturally responsive services to our survivors. But then nothing really changes, right? And then we go back to making suggestions. And essentially you all can see, right, with the cycle of abuse, that it's something that continues again and again. And we know that with domestic violence survivors, it takes them an average of 7 times to go through this before they leave an abuser, right? There hasn't been much study done on how this shows up in organizations, something that Healing Equity United is looking into. So I can't tell you how many times BIPOC or global majority folks go through this before leaving an organization, but it's something for us to consider. And so what we did next in recognizing that this cycle happens in organizations is that we then looked at it through the perspective of white supremacy. Now, we know nonprofit organizations and the nonprofit sector is heavily rooted in white supremacy principles. And really, upholding white supremacy is about holding onto power and control within the community. And what's interesting is that when we looked at the power and control wheel for domestic violence, we also saw that the same types of violence and abuse that happens to survivors also may happen to staff with marginalized identities. And so what Fiona and I are going to do is to kind of take us through each one of these. And so let's start with talking about, using intimidation. And so using intimidation in the workplace might mean, staff who identify with the marginalized identities might feel unsafe from other folks. We were recently talking to someone who identified as Black and was getting looks and really unwelcoming glances from other people. It could also look like folks hanging up a White Lives Matter sign in their cubicle. And really looking at, what are the ways that intimidation might show up. There's also emotional abuse that might occur in the workplace. And so that might be gaslighting, name calling, purposefully using the wrong pronouns, even when we've corrected them time and time again, mispronouncing names or asking if they can give us a nickname instead, humiliating individuals and making them feel like by having, us use correct pronouns and say their names, that they're kind of a burden to the community. It can also look like when people report, concerns. We minimize it. It could look like denying it, blaming the individual, saying, well, I don't really think that the ED was thinking this way. It's really not about that. It's about the grants, right? This is what our funders want. This is what our donors want. We're not purposefully hiring and promoting white folks. That might just be what you're thinking because you're not seeing the pool of applicants that are coming in. It can also be isolation. So thinking about who goes to coalition meetings or partnership meetings, restricting access, not allowing people to go to certain meetings or providing, an actual seat at the table and having them kind of sit on the side. Those are some of the things that do show up in terms of the power and control issues in nonprofits. Fiona, why don't you go through the rest of the wheel, starting with economic abuse?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. So economic abuse, let's face it, we're not in this work to make millions of dollars, right? But what we also see is that particularly for staff who have marginalized identities, right? There's a threat of being terminated. We've seen examples of, um, folks speaking out and participating in a report that highlighted the experience of advocates of color, only to find themselves terminated after they participated in the process, right? Withholding raises and promotions because they've been deemed to have rocked the boat. They're talking about equity too much. They are asking for change, right? In terms of using employer privilege, we see this all the time in the sector. Top-down decision-making without incorporating the voices, perspectives, lived experiences, and thoughts of those who are closer to the work, who have the lived experience, who have varied identities. And so another thing, a backdrop for this, which I don't know if we've already mentioned, is that the sector is primarily white-led, right? And so if the sector is primarily white-led in terms of who's in the executive leadership positions, but those who are more recent hires or providing the direct services are folks who identify as members of the global majority, i.e. Black, Indigenous, and people of color, right? That employer privilege piece is really key because it's those in leadership who could be bad mouthing you and the rest of the sector, right? So if you leave the organization, are you going to find another space in another organization that hasn't already heard about you from this pre-existing leader in your existing organization, right? Using coercion or threats, and that's retaliation towards folks, like I just mentioned in that other example of them being fired. If you demand or ask for certain types of change or acknowledgement of how systematic racism might be showing up in your organization, that you are targeted as the problematic employee. That you feel unsafe in your space, that you're walking on pins and needles in the space in terms of what you can say, should say, how you show up. And then finally, psychological abuse. I tell Jess and Cassie this all the time. I've worked in a variety of spaces. I've worked in the domestic violence space for the longest period of time in my career. And for me, that was the most abusive sector that I've ever worked in. And the psychological abuse was huge, where people spoke over you, given your marginalized identity, constantly interrupted you, belittled your ideas, challenged your expertise, undermined you, right? You literally yelled at you and were almost at least in my experience that I've had, like almost physically violent and eruptive at certain points. So that's the other half of the wheel. Jess?
And so how do we flip this around, right? And so for our organizations that are really pushing for solidarity and shared power, we looked at essentially this wheel that also exists in our sector, at what are the things that we need to do to build support, right? And so things like non-threatening behavior, respect, trust and support, community economic freedom, shared responsibility, shared leadership and accountability are just some of the things. And so let's talk a little bit about this. And so one thing with regards to respect is really, actively listening to marginalized individuals, accepting feedback when harm occurs, saying that, we understand that the intention might be different, but that the impact is really what matters. And we should really be addressing the impact as well. It could also be, using the correct pronouns, pronouncing names correctly, not trying to give people a nickname. When it comes to trust and support, really thinking about how do we support the professional goals of folks with marginalized identities? How do we respect their rights to their rights to also feel comfort? And in what ways can we support racial trauma and healing as well? When it comes to community, providing opportunities for folks with marginalized opportunities to lead and participate in high stakeholder discussions as well as meetings. One organization that I'm currently actually on the board of, the ED a couple of years ago was a white woman, and our organization served primarily Asian folks. And so the ED always brought along, never went to a single meeting by herself, and always brought along a case manager, a program manager, and knew that her role is to exercise her positional power to sit in that meeting and say, yes, I'm here, but really you should be talking to my other staff, and actually turn the meeting over. And always referring back, so that if a funder was asking her a question, she would turn to the staff and say, well, what do you think? When it comes to economic freedom, having transparent economic decisions and pay, promoting based on potential, not just performance. And we know that this is also a gender issue, in that men tend to be promoted and get higher salaries based on potential, whereas women always have to prove themselves first. And then valuing lived experiences and paying for lived experiences as though those are expertise, right? So that's another way of really looking at economic freedom. Fiona, do you want to talk about the shared responsibility, shared leadership, accountability, and non-threatening behavior?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. And so we're going to be going into more specificity regarding shared responsibility, but suffice it to say for this moment in time is that if we are really going to address and dismantle how white supremacy shows up in the sector and doing the work and mitigating the impact it might have on staff and survivors of color, and we've already stipulated that leadership is primarily white, right? And the sector of executive directors and things like that are primarily white. We have to figure out how to share power, responsibility, share power and responsibility in a more equitable way. What do we mean by that? You have to share decision making. So whether that be in, we just got over the end of the fiscal year and you have to create a budget. Well, was that budget created in a silo with only a less than a handful of people in on that decision? Or was there some kind of empowerment throughout varied components of the organization so that people can make informed decisions and contribute to that process? Shared leadership, providing enough information in order to effectively lead. Leadership, we understand that at the end of the day, the executive director is the one who is legally held liable and responsible for what the organization does. It's the board of directors that has that fiduciary duty. We understand that, but leadership should not be exclusive to those two spaces, right? And as those who really want to promote equity and inclusive, diverse communities that cultivate belonging, then we should invite others to the leadership spaces. What are your thoughts? What are your perspectives? What do you think we should do as we proceed? Now, ultimately, we might not decide to move in that direction, but your thoughts are valued. Your time is valued. And it's actually incorporated into the process. And then accountability. We've talked at Healing Equity United about the whole everybody's on the bandwagon of creating DEI statements now. Everybody has one. Well, that's not true. Not everybody has one, but many have them, and they say, okay, that's the start and end of all we need to do. Like, we need to hold each other accountable and say, no, that's not all we need to do, and we can do so much more. So, accountability is about accepting responsibility when you are called in that regard, and then communicating honestly about your process. You know, we messed up when we said that that statement was enough. We heard you, and we are moving forward in this way, and that way. And then non-threatening behavior. This is a big one, right? So we have to foster brave spaces where it's okay for folks of the global majority to uh, express their experiences, to be honest and transparent about their experiences without being faced with defensiveness, without being faced with argumentation. No, 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 no. That really wasn't what Susie intended. And apologies to anyone named Susie out there, right? That wasn't what we meant. That wasn't what we intended. And folks shouldn't feel that anger um, in conjunction with just relaying the truth of their lived experience. Jess?
And so we want to talk a little bit about power and control in the nonprofit sector as well, Fiona.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, in terms of the nonprofit sector, we know that even though the goal of many of our nonprofits is social justice, right? We have to understand that the entire sector, because our entire society is rooted in systemic oppression, it's rooted in white supremacy, right? And so, you know, even this typical hierarchy structure, right, with the executive director at the bottom and like maybe the hotline advocate, the executive director at the top, rather, and the hotline advocate um, at the bottom, right? And a series of directors in the middle, or the deputy director at the second. Like, that replicates norms of oppression, right? As opposed to approaching a more, well, there's a lot of controversy about having a collapsed hierarchy and no hierarchy in organizations. Oh my goodness, what would we do if we didn't have a hierarchy in our organization? But that's a conversation for another day. For these purposes, we simply want to get folks in the DV sector to acknowledge the ways in which power and control are replicated in the nonprofit sector, whether that be in terms of our funding sources, right? So we know where we get our money from. Some of them are state, some of them are federal, and then they have some stipulations and strings attached to that money that says we should do this, this, and this, right? Many times we might be excluded from being more progressive with our culturally accessible service provision, or we might be limited in the amount of PTO that we can allocate due to racialized trauma and harm, right? So we have to recognize and be able to identify the ways that power and control, white supremacy shows up in our sector, in our organization. And once we recognize it, identify it, be specific about it, then work towards dismantling the specific ways it may show up in our organization, in our sector, and in our jurisdiction. So, Jess, would you add anything to that?
You know, I think one of the things that really irks me a little bit, Fiona, is that in the domestic violence field, we often talk about how the survivors are the experts of their own lives, right? And so we try to share power with survivors in terms of, letting them know all of the different options that are out there. We might have an opinion about what they should do, but we don't force that opinion on them, right? Because ultimately they have to decide what's best for them. If they have children, what's best for their children. And so, one of the things that I want to think about us talking about, Fiona, is really, well, we have that process and that value set up for survivors. And at the same time, why do we not have that in our organizations, right? And what about people in our organizations with marginalized identities who are also survivors? Because we know, even without, asking our staff, and I would not, encourage, having staff, forcing the staff to tell us whether they're a survivor or not, but we generally know that we have survivors on staff, right? And so let's talk a little bit more about what shared leadership is. And what does that really mean for organizations? So what do you think, Fiona?
Yeah, and we said that we would get back to this one. So shared leadership is about shared responsibility and shared accountability, right? And so if we say, and I gave an example of, the creating the budget because we just entered a new fiscal year. Now, if I say I'm going to engage all of our programs, I'm going to engage folks from every level of our programs in this budget creation process, then there is the responsibility for all of us to move into that space of power, right? To become more educated and have the support of becoming more educated regarding finances and budgets so that we can participate knowledgeably. And then if we don't take up that responsibility, that we are held accountable, right? So when it comes to uplifting a framework of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, that also means that everyone has a role to play. It's not just, everybody is hiring a director of people and culture now, or a director of DEI now, right? It's not just that one person's responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility, and everyone has to share in leading and uplifting that framework. Would you add anything, Jess?
No, I think that's good. And so we're actually going to turn it over to Cassie now, because we're gonna do some Q&A, because we do see that there are some questions that are coming in.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. The first one that we want to address, someone asked, can you speak to the issue of ageism as it relates to this topic?
Would you like to go first, Jess? Because
No,
I
go
know
ahead.
that, okay. So it's at both spectrums for me, right? So that's such a great question. In our sector, let's be honest, there are some folks of a certain age and time and space of the DV movement who are in leadership who aren't necessarily ready to be out of leadership, right? And so that approach, the subsequent approach is, we tried that 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago and it didn't work. Or, I've built up these decades of experience and so I know what I'm talking about. Or, that isn't really how we should be moving forward. On the other hand, you have some younger folks coming into the space who are like, I have gray hair. You can see I have gray hair. All you old people, you don't know what you're doing. Move aside, get out the way. Let us take it all over, right? And I think that the approach to DEIB says that there's value in all. as long as we have humility in how we approach it, right? So I have to be humble about my professional experience and what I have seen in the field while still being open to hearing what younger folks are experiencing, what the thoughts and perspectives of younger folks are in doing this work. And hopefully, somewhere between the two are some great ideas about how to move forward. Because I do think that ageism is real, both towards the older folks and the younger folks in this sector. And I don't know what that age sweet spot supposedly is, but I've always found myself either too young or too old to be relevant to anybody in doing this work. It always seems like it's out to, you know, it raises its ugly head. So Jess, what do you think?
I think one of the things that I see in nonprofit organizations when it comes to power and control is that sometimes, younger folks are isolated. They're restricted from certain meetings, right? It's like, well, this meeting is just for senior leaders. And this might be an organization that is primarily working with teenagers on healthy relationships. And so really the flip side of looking at isolation is community. How do we provide opportunities for younger folks to lead and participate in these, important discussions and meetings? And what I would say is that, sometimes when I've talked to other executive directors about this, I get some pushback. I get pushback like, well, they're in their early 20s. This is their first job. They don't really understand how it works. They don't understand that we have restricted grants and that there are certain things that we have to do for our funders, right? But what I can tell you is that when I was in ED, I was as transparent as I could be. And I would say things like, the reason that we can't do something specifically is because this grant funds our work in Washington, D.C. And my job is to make sure everyone stays employed. And what I can do as an advocate, if we don't agree with certain things, is to go back to the funder. And that's the role I play in terms of our shared leadership and shared accountability. But, really thinking about that sometimes that happens, right? And then sometimes there's also emotional abuse towards, older folks, calling them names, right? Humiliating them because they don't know how to use Zoom. And really it's thinking about respect and how do we actively listen to them in understanding what their challenges are, being patient with them to help them find the mute and unmute buttons, accepting feedback when harm occurs. And that's just a couple of things that I'm thinking about with respect to ageism.
Jess, can I give one more example? Because as you were speaking, I was reminded of this. So when I first graduated from law school, the executive director of the organization that I was with at the time would take me to a fairly high level meeting regularly, in which we had the district attorney, chief police representation, other legislators at the table. And that executive director wouldn't introduce me as, oh, here's my lowly level, barely out of her 20s. Like it was, this is a crucial member of my team, and I value her voice, and you all are going to value her voice and presence as well. Right. And so, after several times of bringing me to that meeting, bringing me into that space, she no longer showed up, because she had given me or shared power in such a way that those in that space knew that I spoke with power and authority for the organization. So that's another way of, older folks and younger folks collaborating and sharing power in that space and addressing ageism.
Thank you both for those answers. Moving on to the next question. Someone said, I believe I'm seen as the problematic employee when I bring up issues. I recently attended a conference where I was asked to bring information back to the agency, but I learned more about the agency's leadership issues and want to have a meeting with the leaders. How do I approach and bring that forward without getting shut down?
First of all, I'm sorry. Second of all, you're not alone. Many of us go through this. I would say that there are a couple of different ways to go about it, right? Find co-conspirators in the organization. Is there someone else in the organization who can carry that message and be heard more effectively without being targeted or labeled than you? Are there co-conspirators on the board who can be identified, who don't necessarily have to use your name or your experience, or this is what I heard at the conference, because obviously then that identifies you, right? But are there other folks who can effectively share the word and spur change with existing leadership who might not be open to change right now? I have some other ideas, but I want to give you just some space.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Fiona. I would think about, the allies that you may have. I think the other, and if you have an ally in leadership, that's great. If not, and it doesn't sound like you may have, I would think about people who are influential. Who does the leadership team listen to? That's who's not on the leadership team. Because being able to influence someone is also a type of power that shows up, right, in the organization. And so could those folks be your allies in bringing this forward? So that's the other thing that I would recommend.
I'm
Thank
sorry,
you.
Cassie. I always have just one more thing to say.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I would also encourage folks to remember their own power and the sanctity of their own spirit and well-being. So one thing that popped out from that question for me is like, if I felt like I was the problem person and I felt, I don't want to put words into this person's mouth, but if I felt like some kind of way, um, attend to your spirit and your business and know that there is a space where you don't have to feel that way. There is an organization that will not make you feel this way. And if there isn't, well, we all have the power to create them, right? And create our spaces. But I just felt called to put that out there as well. We are not powerless in these situations.
Thank you, Fiona. Thanks for adding that in. So this next one, perhaps less of a question, but I noticed a lot of overlap between what you've named so far and the shift towards carceral approaches to addressing DVSA within this work and the professionalization moving out of activist/movement spaces that have shifted the focus to individual-based direct services rather than support services being couched in the movement level and grassroots work. I'd be curious to hear y'all's thoughts on this and if/how you see this showing up and where we can make interventions.
I've started first both times, so you go first, Jess. Okay. So this is a big one for me because I feel like, okay, I'm going to be slightly controversial. And that's okay. That's okay. I'm going to say it messy. Those were one of our group agreements. That as the movement began to accept more and more dollars in order to sustain the work from some spaces, right? Those spaces being rooted in the systems of oppression that I talked about earlier, there were certain limitations put on the work. The focus on professionalization, the focus on having to be a social worker or have an SW or having to be a lawyer, have an ESQ behind your last name, or in order to demonstrate impact, you have to have a PhD and come back as an evaluator and write a report, whereas the community is out there doing the work every day. And that isn't sufficient to demonstrate impact. From my perspective, that's purposeful. That is not a mistake. that that is happened. That is not a mistake that our movement has moved in that direction. And it was intentional to leave some folks out of the decision making, to leave some communities out of, some of the community-based responses and culturally specific responses that weren't deemed palatable by those in power. Now, does that mean I say burn it all down? No. But I do think that we have to be okay with creating space for some of this other work to be happening in conjunction with and at the same time as our existing system. But yes, I completely agree that as we've shifted to, professionalizing the whole thing, we've purposefully left out swaths of communities and populations that have subsequently been detrimentally impacted by that. Jess, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it.
All right. One last one in the last minute, if we could share any thoughts on this. How would someone address if there were layoffs due to financial reasons, but then C-suite members secretly got raises?
Go ahead, Fiona.
Okay, so many things are coming to mind for that one, but one thing that I would say, as Jess always says, there's calling in, calling out, and calling within. Now, if there is something truly, underhanded or can't be legitimately explained by that, I think that would be a calling out situation. Whether that be calling out with the board or calling out in the community, in the sector, or calling out by getting maybe coalition leaders involved to highlight what the problem is or what transpired, or calling out by going to media. I don't know what the case may be, but not knowing any details of what you're referring to, it sounds like a lack of transparency, to say the least, and a need for some information to be shared, and if not, then folks to be held accountable for that disparity and disparate treatment.
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot to unpack in that scenario. So we just wanted to take a moment to take a breath and to close us out with a quote. We've covered a lot during our time together. Quotes up on the screen, I'll also read it aloud for accessibility purposes. This is from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. "We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people." And so I felt like this was a good way for us to close. And Jess, if you wanted to name anything else before we close our time together.
So we will be sending out the recording and the slides to those of you who've registered, as well as we can also send out the circles on a separate document. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that you will join us for our next webinar. Have a great day and happy Domestic Violence Awareness Month.